Rabbi Simcha Krauss was born in Romania. He arrived at a young age to the United States, studied in Chaim, Berlin with Rav Yitzchak Hutner, and received his Yoreh Yoreh and Yadin Yadin, learning later with Rabbi Soloveitchik. Rabbi Krauss served in synagogues in Utica, New York, in St. Louis, and in Hillcrest. An ardent Zionist, he also led the Religious Zionists of America just before he made Aliyah in the early 2000s. And while on Aliyah, he became one of the Rosh Yeshiva at Yeshivat Eretz Hatzvi. In his latter years, he headed the IBD. And most important, he was the father of Bini and Shana, Rivka and Tully, Aviva and Dani Shai, and of course, the dear, dear husband of our beloved Esther. Perhaps not coincidentally, the daf this today is Moed Katan and Moed Katan daf tet. And this daf actually focuses on the halacha of Ein Ma'arvim Simcha B'Simcha. And the Gemara offers various interpretations as to we don't mix Simcha with Simcha. And Rashi, it's not really clear that it was Rashi in Moed Katan, but Rashi has this language in summarizing the issue. He says, Be'inon delismach lechudei. Sometimes it's important to focus on one simcha without having it clouded, without having it interrupted by other smachot. That is, that sometimes the simcha is so great, so meaningful, so powerful that it deserves full attention and focus. And that's our Rav Simcha. That's Rabbi Simcha Krauss. The Gemara goes on to ask Minolan, how do we know this? How do we know that sometimes the simcha is so profound that it deserves our full attention? And I would humbly suggest, that today on this sad day, when Yedidenu, Rav Simcha was buried in Eretz Yisrael, that to the Gemara's question of Minolan, how do you know it? Where do you see it? We see it in Rabbi Simcha Krauss. His favorite nigun, his favorite pasuk, which really was foundational to his life, was a pasuk in Tehillim, Ma ahavti Toratecha, Kol hayom hisichati. How I love you, my Torah. All the time, all the days, every moment, I meditate upon you. But what made Rav Simcha's Torah l'chudei? What made it unique? And perhaps not coincidentally as well, this is the parsha, the week of Mamad Har Sinai, of Revelation. And if anything, Mamad Har Sinai teaches us that Torah was not given in a vacuum. And given in a framework which breathes the message of Reb Simcha's Torah. Reb Simcha was a profound Talmid Chacham. But the Torah says, as it was given, Vayotze Moshe et ha'am likrat ha'elokim, that the Torah was revealed to the Milashon Am, Milashon Im, with, connecting Torah to Am Yisrael. Torah, which remains only in the Bet Midrash, could be divorced from reality. It could be separated from the human condition, a kind of learning in the ivory tower. Now, although Rav Simcha was so steeped in the Torah of the yeshiva, he made a conscious decision not to remain in the Bet Midrash alone, but to synthesize that learning with being a Rav Kihila, to be a congregational rabbi. For Rav Simcha, Torah was not only an Eitz Hadat, a tree of knowledge, but it was an Eitz HaChaim, it was tree of life. As Rav Simcha focused on the words of the Torah, when he looked at a siman or a seif in the Shulchan Aruch, when he analyzed a Rishon or an Achron, when he saw the holy letters of the Torah, they somehow were reframed and reshaped. And he was looking at people. He was looking at Am Yisrael, each individual. He was looking at every human being, all created B'Tselem Elokim. I remember visiting his community, the Young Israel of Hillcrest. He was so kind and asked me to share a Shabbat with him. And as soon as you walked in, within 2 minutes, you could feel the love in that sanctuary that individuals had for Rabbi Simcha. I heard then the legends of Rabbi Simcha Krauss, how he was loved by his students at Eretz HaTzvi, his graciousness, the way he said thank you and thank you and thank you to all people. Reb Simcha's Torah was not a vacuous Torah. It was a Torah that connected the words and the holiness of words to the holiness of the Tzelem Elokim of people. And his Torah went beyond that. Intrinsic to Rav Simcha's Torah was a sense of ethics. For Rav Simcha Krauss, Yididi, Yosha, a sense of goodness and righteousness, was not separate from halacha, but it was embedded in its message. And so in the Parsha of Mamad Har Sinai, the pasuk says, "Vayanu chol ha'am yachdav vayomru," and the people answered and said, "Kol asher diber Hashem naseh." Everything that God has asked, we will do, and ultimately, at the end of Parshat Mishpatim, naseh v'nishma. Naseh, the people say. Naseh, as the prophet Micha declares, Higid lecha adam ma tov u'ma Hashem doresh mimcha. What does God ask from us? Ki im asot naseh v'nishma. Ki im asot mishpat v'yavat chesed. This was Reb Simcha's Torah. It was in the spirit of Dracheha Darchi Noam. The ways of the Torah are pleasant. V'chol netivoteha shalom. All of its pathways are peace. Reb Simcha headed the IBD, and of course was so close to our dear beloved Blue Greenberg and Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, so close with our own Rabbi Zach Truba, who was playing such a central role in the IBD these days, was especially close to our own Rabbi Dan Margulies. Reb Simcha felt the tears of Agunot, and he knew that this was not God's wish. And he knew that this was not the wish of Chachmei HaTalmud, Rishonim and Achronim. He just knew that in the halachic system, there was a way, and there is a way to once and for all resolve these issues. And one last framework, if you will, of Rav Simcha's Lichudei, of Rav Simcha's unique approach to Torah. Ultimately, the Am is described as standing alone. Later on in the Torah, we're told, Hen Am levadad yishkom. And the test of leadership, the test of Torah leadership, is standing up for principle because it's the right thing to do. And often one has to stand up livadad. And this, in a certain sense, was not who Rav Simcha was, from the perspective that he was not a fighter. He just wasn't a fighter. With all of his brilliance, he had a sweetness, a humility, a depth of caring. He had a she'ifah to conciliation, and yet he wasn't afraid to stand alone. In the late 90s, in 1997, the Queen's Vad, and Rav Simcha served as the rabbi of the Young Israel of Hillcrest, ruled almost unanimously against women's prayer groups. And Rav Simcha was a lone voice. It's not easy in the presence of your colleagues whom Rav Simcha cared about to cast that nay vote. It took a lot of courage. Sometimes must be levadad yishko. And in 2015, it pains me to say, there were letters that came from Rosh Yeshiva excoriating Rav Simcha, his IBD rulings. And I want to read to you the words of Rav Simcha. This is how a gadol responds. Not only a gadol who knows Torah and halacha so well, but a gadol who lives the Gemara that we just passed in the daf of b'makom gedulato sham anvitanuto. After receiving this letter, which was so painful, he wrote and said, and I quote, "You can hurt me, you can insult me, but in the end of the day, this is not about me. We're standing up for these women. And if we win, the whole community wins. And if we lose, more is lost than we can ever know." What a legacy. One of the women whom he stood up for said the following: Rabbi Simcha Krauss, as he ruled on my case, and I quote, "He dotted every I, crossed every T. He was so genuine, so compassionate. He is my only lifeline. He is my only lifeline." Rav Simcha, L'chudei. What a unique Reb Simcha you were. And as much Reb Simcha as you were, the Rav of the people, of Am Yisrael, Torah Yisrael, and Eretz Yisrael, my dear Simcha, you were a Saba. You were an Abba. You were the beloved spouse of our dear Esther. And listening to the Levaya just a few moments ago from Yerushalayim, listening to you, our dear Rav Bini, listening, Rav Simcha, to your daughters, seeing the way they were embracing your Esther, a Talmidah Chachama in her own right, was so uplifting. Listening to the grandchildren, speaking of the way you wanted to listen to their ideas, reinforcing, allowing them and encouraging them to believe in themselves. And on a very personal note, Rav Simcha, as a dear Talmud of yours, you were really a Rebbe Chaver. A personal thank you to Rav Simcha. A personal thank you. When Chovevei was created, it was a lonely time for many, many people. But you came and you gave shiurim at Yeshivat Chovevei Torah. And you learned in the Bet Midrash. You were enamored by Rav Dov. You joined the Yeshivat Chovevei Torah Honorary Rabbinic Committee. Oh, pashut, at a time when there was such a pushback. Rav Stephen, my dear Rav Stephen, reminded me how you, Rav Simcha, and this is what a Rebbe is all about, as difficult as it was for you to walk when you were in Riverdale doing work for the IBD, when you spent a few years here just recently, you walked to hear Rav Stephen's Shabbat Shuva Drasha, Shabbat Hagadol Drasha, how uplifting it was for him. And Rav Stephen, I'm sure, was then speaking for every student at Chovevei whom you inspired. And during those lonely days, Rav Simcha, you were so kind. Yes, you would mamish learn in the Bet Midrash. And Esther, Rabbi Sarah would say that you became the Aim Maharat. You became the Ima in the deepest, kindest way of Marat, as you learned in the Marat Bet Midrash, day in and day out, looking up to Rav Jeff and speaking to you the way you were taken by the students and connected to all the students. Rav Simcha, I had such deep respect for you. So many respected you and looked up to you. And not only respected you, but I loved you and will always love you, Rav Simcha. As Rashi says again in the Gemara, Be'inan delismach l'chudei. You are Reb Simcha as only Reb Simcha Krauss could be. Reb Simcha is Einenu. But Reb Simcha, your legacy, your influence will be forever, forever suffused with the multitude of messages of Ma ahavti Toratecha, Kol hayom b'sichati. In Rav Simcha's honor, I ask for all to join me. Ma ahavti Toratecha, Kol hayom b'sichati. 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 Rav Simcha ahavti otcha, Kol hayom b'sichati. Lech b'shalom, tanuach b'shalom. Yidid nafshi Rabsi Yimcha. Ma ahavti Toratecha, Kol hayom b'sichati. Ma ahavti Toratecha, Kol hayom b'sichati.
Thank you, Rabbi Weiss, for those powerful words. It's really so unique to have the combination of greatness in Torah and sense of yosher and being willing to stand up and not budge an inch when the cause of what is right. And we were just, the great Gadol has passed from our midst, and we are all in mourning. And I really thank you so much, Rabbi Weiss, for your words.